Let's see what that looks like on a moss. If we see plants that we're used to thinking about, that should hopefully clarify this life cycle a little bit more. Before we get into the terminology, think for just a minute about this moss life cycle. Is this green leafy part of the moss a gametophyte? Is this a haploid organism? Or is it a sporophyte like us? Is it a diploid? So you might be tempted to think that it was diploid because we're used to thinking of the organisms that we see up and planted or moving around as being diploid. But in this case, actually, the green leafy part of a moss that you're seeing here is haploid. It only has one complete set of chromosomes. Very different from what we're used to thinking about. Here's the gametophyte. So because the gametophyte, or this leafy part of the moss, is haploid, has one complete set of chromosomes, if it's going to produce gametes, it's going to do that through the process of mitosis, which is different from animals by far. Because in order to create a haploid gamete, the cells in the leafy gametophyte simply need to divide. And here we can therefore see the sperm and the egg, the haploid cells that will fuse to form a zygote and grow up into a sporophyte. And here is the sporophyte of the moss plant. This is the diploid part of the moss. So you've probably all seen green leafy carpets of moss on the forest floor with these little stalks sticking out of them. So on those plants, the green leafy part has one complete set of chromosomes, and the stalk with the capsule on the top has two. If we continue our progression, this is where meiosis happens in the moss, not to produce the gametes, but to produce the spores, which are haploid. So we had a 2N sporophyte producing through meiosis and a reduction division, 1N spores. Those spores fall to the ground of whatever habitat they're in, start to grow, and form a new green leafy haploid gametophyte, and the cycle starts again. So we've thought about this now in mosses, which are a much earlier to evolve species. They don't have vascular tissue. They spend a good share of their life cycle in a haploid form. What about a flowering plant, which is what we've spent much more of our time talking about in class this semester? Is that flowering plant spending most of its time in a haploid state or in a diploid state? I think I said earlier in the diploid state. And let's look through that flowering plant life cycle in a little more detail. So here's a flower. It's in that diploid state. We're going to carry it through the life cycle. So that flower, in order to reproduce, is going to need to go through the process of meiosis to form spores, just like the moss. These aren't very visible to us. It's all happening within the flower. And there's a male and a female version of the spore in this plant. Those spores grow by mitosis into gametophytes that are haploid, a micro and a mega gametophyte, the male and the female. And then those gametophytes form the gametes. Here's the egg, here's the sperm. So this would be where the pollen is formed. Those gametes fuse, they form the zygote, which is now back to being diploid, and is going to then grow by mitosis, develop the seed, which can then germinate and grow into the plant, and then produce more flowers. Let's emphasize where the distinction is between the diploid and the haploid state in this flowering plant. It's very obvious in the moss. It's a little harder to see in the flowering plant. Where are the transitions between the diploid sporophyte and the haploid gametophyte? So think for a minute, kind of draw it on your screen if you can. Okay, here's the division. So everything that you see after the process of meiosis and before the fusion of the gametes is going to be the part of the plant that's in the haploid state with one complete set of chromosomes. Once the gametes are produced here and they fuse, at this fusion, now we're going from being haploid to being diploid. So everything on this side, this is the part of the plant that you're used to seeing. This is the diploid, the sporophyte state of the plant. If you have questions about this, feel free to stop by office hours. Life cycles are complicated, and I have explained them many, many times in many different ways, and I'm still looking for the best way to help people understand this switch in generations. The alternation of generations is a complicated concept for many of us. Okay, so let's think now last about flower structure, because that's where you're focused for the lab this week. You're thinking about the structure of a lily flower, which is very similar in certain ways to a lot of other flowers, different in others, but you'll start to get comfortable with the terminology. And here's a picture of a flower. Very important to learn the parts of the flower. So when you go through the quiz, you'll see these parts come up. You'll see them in the lab. Important to understand these different pieces of the flower. That we have the pistil here. This is the female part of the flower. We have the anthers that are creating the pollen that moves to the stigma of the pistil in the fertilization process. We have the petals around the outside. Those are what are going to be attracting insect pollinators, for example, and then the sepals here. A complete flower is going to have all four parts. An incomplete flower will lack at least one of these. Here we're going to focus a little bit on the sepals. Those are the outermost leaf-like structures. They're usually green. Sometimes they can be colorful. In the lilies that you'll see in the video, the sepals and the petals look almost identical, but that's not true in a number of other plant groups. Petals are above the sepals. They're leaf-like. They're usually colorful. They attract pollinators, but they might be absent in wind-pollinated species. We talked about the stamens that include the anthers where the pollen is produced, and then this diagram is of the pistil. I wanted to take a minute to look at this because there's terminology in your lab handout that's also shown here. That a pistil is usually formed from one or more carpels. These evolve from leaves. They're often fused together. So each of these three compartments here is a separate carpel. There are three carpels on this particular flower. And these carpels contain the ovules. Those are these little bits here, or you can see them blown up here, that will become the seeds. And then the ovary is this entire chamber here, and that's what's going to become the fruit as that plant continues to develop. There's a lot of variation in flower structure among the eudicots, a lot. And so if you look at a picture like this, you can see some of that variation. You'll be looking actually at a monocot species, at a lily, in the video that you're looking at for lab. So once you add the monocots in there as well, the variation gets pretty remarkable among the different flowers. And so when you think about their purpose in attracting pollinators, you can see why there would be so much variation in how these flowers develop. You'll see in the lab handout that the variation among the flowers has been used to help in our understanding of different species of flowers in order to classify them. That diagnostic variation is part of their taxonomy. So when you look at a flower, you look for a number of different kinds of characteristics. You look at the symmetry of the flower, whether the flower is radially symmetrical, like you see here. You can divide it among many different axes, and the two halves will always be identical, or bilateral, as you see here, where you can only really divide it along one direction and have two identical halves. The numbers of parts tend to be diagnostic, how many petals, how many sepals, how many carpels. The attachment of different structures can be diagnostic as well of different types of flowers. So this will come up in your lab handout as well. The ovary of the flower, the base of the pistil, can be superior. You can see that here where the ovary attaches above where the petals and sepals attach. Or the ovary can be inferior, where here you can see in these examples, the ovary is down here, and then the petals and sepals attach up top. And so you'll be looking for that in the video of the dissection of the lily flower as well. And then you'll see references to whether parts might be fused or free. So if they're fused, then all of the like parts would be connected to each other. You can see that in this diagram, where these 5 different petals are fused before they reach the attachment point, as opposed to petals like on this flower, where the petals have an attachment point in the center and they're not fused to each other. So you'll see questions about that in your lab handout as well. You'll be using Chapter 11 of the Vascular Plant Taxonomy text by Zach Merle to start to learn this terminology and understand how it can be applied. So just to summarize, we've spent some time thinking about advantages and disadvantages of different types of plant reproduction and some of the key adaptations that separate the angiosperms from the other plant groups, notably the flowers. By the end of your work this week, you should be able to trace a flowering plant through its life cycle, understand what's meant by the alternation of generations, understand that alternation between a diploid and a haploid state that's very typical of the plant life cycle, and then also make sure that you can define the key structures of the flower. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to stop by office hours or make an appointment or send me an email. Thanks.